Fridays, I work out of the Gifted office with Ginny, and then I'm out supporting other schools besides the that are on my caseload with professional development or help with identification.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to get started, and if you have questions, please use the chat, and between the two of us, we're going to try to get to them. And keep in mind that we're recording these, so they will be on demand. If you think your staff could use an entire PD on this, you can reach out to our office and we can get that scheduled. I work mostly with middle and high school, but I'm certainly familiar and worked with elementary as well. I'm going to go over the expectations. I think this is probably the third time and it seems to be clearer now, but remember, if you're registered in PD Central, you're only completing 2 1-hour sessions in a 3-hour time block. And so this would be the last option. So I hope that everyone here has already done a session, because if this is your first session, you haven't done the necessary 2 time slots. So be aware of that. And then, of course, moving forward, we hope to see you this afternoon. Colin Seal is going to be our keynote. He's amazing, and we're very excited that we were able to get him, and we hope to see a good turnout for him. Walk-ins are welcome. Anything to add, Lindsay?
Nope, I think you covered it.
Great. Okay, I'm going to let Lindsay share our learning goals today.
So we are here today talking about special considerations for underrepresented populations and gifted. And so our learning goals for today are, we're going to learn how to use the special considerations identification that is outlined in KDE Law. We're going to determine equity issues in your schools and our district's GT identification. We're going to discuss ways that we can prevent gatekeepers in terms of racial, linguistic, and socioeconomic equity in gifted and talented. And then we're also going to identify some characteristics of giftedness in some of those underrepresented students.
Okay, great.
So we're going to start by talking about some of the issues that we see in gifted education in terms of inequity, racially, linguistically, socioeconomically. And so these are kind of the top 4 reasons for some of those inequities that we see in gifted identification. One of them is educator bias and under-referral. Educators often tend to, when looking at gifted identification, have a deficit view, thinking about what they can't do, instead of focusing on a proficiency view. What can the students actually do and what strengths do they bring? Another one that most of us are probably aware of is test bias and issues. We know that many of the formal tests that are used for gifted identification have biases, linguistically, social biases, and cultural biases that prevent a lot of those populations of students from making that cutoff score. Another issue of inequity is an acultural view of giftedness, and what that means is that a view of giftedness that where culture doesn't matter, it's the same in all cultures, which just isn't true. So not taking in cultural differences into consideration in that identification process leads to kind of those inequities. And then the last one is just an inequitable opportunity to learn or have given opportunities to be challenged where those gifted characteristics can come out. So we know based on what school or where they're going to school or the funding in that school can lead to just inequitable opportunities for students to be challenged, as well as like opportunities that allow those gifted characteristics to be shown.
And our keynote speaker, his entire book that we're promoting and sharing with you, he really focuses on what he calls the critical thinking gap, just for the same reasons Lindsay lays out. He says you can draw a line in cities and see that certain kids are exposed to critical thinking, and unfortunately, we don't expose the kids who probably need it the most. So we really hope that you take this into consideration today. Oops, hang on a minute. Let me back up. I think I hit it too fast. Let's see here. Okay, sorry. Give me just a minute, everybody. Okay, there we go. I'm so sorry. Okay, so we've done that. All right, there you go, Lindsay.
So I just wanted to dig in a little deeper into the acultural view of giftedness, just because I feel like this is just kind of like an underlying bias or issue in our schools, in JCPS, in the state, and across the country in terms of gifted equity. And so an acultural view, it tends to default to the norms of the majority culture. So in this case, we're thinking white, middle, upper class view of giftedness. And so when we're thinking about identifying students for gifted, we tend to, if we don't have training or understanding, we tend to look for just that view. And we don't consider how giftedness would show up differently in different populations. And so we all kind of carry those biases to cultural backgrounds, racial backgrounds, even genders or language. And when we're shaping our own teacher view of giftedness, we kind of take in, I guess, either our own racial or socioeconomic or language view of giftedness, or the dominant culture. And so we want to make sure that when we're looking at gifted identification, that we're considering the backgrounds that our students come from in that identification process. So we wanted to start with the law. So the special considerations is a part of KDE's gifted law. The title actually links to a special considerations document put out by KDE. These are a couple parts that are pulled from that, but I think it's good to know what KDE's law is in terms of special considerations. So special considerations is defined as school personnel shall take into consideration environment, cultural, and disabling conditions which may mask a child's true abilities. Special considerations includes disadvantaged students as identified as operating under conditions detrimental to cognitive or affective growth due to socioeconomic limitations, cultural factors, geographic isolation, or various combinations of these factors. So when we're talking about students who fall under special considerations in our district, that includes African American, that includes Hispanic, that includes students with IEPs, those that qualify for free and reduced lunch, those that are learning English as an additional language, basically any population other than white or Asian students falls under this special considerations policy. And so kind of the purpose of it is to combat the issues that we see with test bias. And so a lot of times these groups struggle due to test bias and to achieve that 9 or 96th percentile that is required for general intellect and specific academic identification. And so the purpose of using special considerations for identification is try to kind of get around those issues and allow a more equitable process for identifying those students. So in the accountability system, it is stated in KDE Law that equitability and gifted, what that looks like is that the demographics of your identified gifted and talented students should match your total school identification. So if you have 45% of your school population is Hispanic, then 45% of your gifted and talented identified students should be Hispanic. So you're looking for evenly, I guess, spread identification that matches your school population, and that no group is under or overrepresented in that gifted population.
Okay, So I want us to just peruse this chart for a few minutes. I want you to look at all the numbers. If you're into data, you'll love this. If you're not, you just kind of have to sit with us. The first column is Jefferson County's data, all of Jefferson County students. The next column is gifted and talented representation in all schools. And then I particularly picked, without calling out anybody, a South End school and an East End school, and showed you their demographics as a school in its entirety, and then their gifted program. And so what we want you to do for just a couple minutes, I'm going to set my timer for 2 minutes, and I want you to use the chat and tell us, what do you notice? What are your thoughts? Does anything stand out to you? And I'm going to set the timer now. And use the chat again as a reminder. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. Thank you, Hannah, for your comment about your school. We hope that many of you now become advocates for this special considerations and help educate your own staff on it. You can reach out to our office. We can come do PDs. We're going to record this. We're trying to make it accessible to as many schools as possible, since we're just a small office of about 7 people for in a district of 155 schools. That's a lot. I see people noticing gender. That's fantastic. Noticing ELL students. These are all the things we want you to notice. Take about a minute more.
And a lot of people are noticing the gender. And so this data wraps up all 5 identification areas into one kind of percentage. And our gender data does look pretty good, and that's been improved over the years. However, if you kind of break it down to specific areas, so think about like specific academic and math, you start to see more gender discrepancies of females not being identified as much in areas like math and science.
And I'm sure it's no surprise that the most commonly identified gifted student is white male. So we want to try to work on opening up our eyes to all types of gifted students. So I'll share with you now. This was data taken from our Kentucky Department of Education school report card. It is 18-19 data, and Lindsay updated a few with current data just to keep it as up to date as possible. We want you to see, I think you saw all the things we wanted you to see. You can see disparities in over-identification in Asian, the green one, and overall we're double that 4%, which is representing JCPS. We're clearly over-identifying whites. 42% of JCPS is white, but 58% of gifted folks. In East End and South End schools, you can see some big differences there as well. So we just kind of wanted you, all numbers don't lie, and we just wanted people to become more aware of the schools. And some schools have got it going on, and some schools need some more representation. And that's okay. We're going to work on it together.
And I do want to point out, somebody in the comments mentioned, and I think this is a really good point, about how behavior plays into identification issues, and you are absolutely 100% correct. Oftentimes, those who have behavior challenges are not identified for gifted simply because of their behavior. And that's a big issue, because just because you have behavior challenges doesn't mean you can't also be gifted. That a lot of times plays into that twice exceptional students with disabilities or an IEP as well, is that you see a lot of issues with getting kids with IEPs for social behaviors identified as GT.
Great point, Lindsay. I'm glad you mentioned that. Thanks for such good dialogue in the chat session. So this is just some of our resources. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but we're going to be using Dr. Donna Ford. A lot of her, she's one of the leading advocates for underrepresented populations in gifted. So we're big fans of hers. So if you're interested, I've linked you to her website and some quotes from where we're getting this information. And then of course, we linked you to KDE report card. If you want to go check out your own school's demographics, we would encourage you to do that. And of course, the NAGC website is always great for getting underrepresented help, looking there. It's a great resource. And a reminder that if you're a walk-in, the link is here. Again, make sure if you are not registered on PD Central that your name gets on our walk-in sheet. And so Dr. Donna Ford is extremely liberal, and she actually feels that lowering the stay 9 to possibly 8th or broadening the inclusiveness of test scores should be even lower, because so many times our underrepresented kids aren't even hitting the 8th stay 9 due to cultural, home, all sorts of differences in their lives. So I'm kind of just showing you something we were taught in our studies. And so she has this 20% equity formula. And so she gives you the formula that you take the percentage of Black students in your district and you multiply that by 20%, and then you get your equity goal. And so you can see I did the math for us using our data, and theoretically the minimum target representation representation is 28.96%. And right now we are only at 19% represented of African Americans. And if I broke down any one of our demographics, you would see these same disparities. And she has one for Hispanics, she has one for ELLs. So you can just see with one demographic, we're greatly underrepresented here. So we really would love to see our numbers this year increase by at least 10%, if not more.
Okay, these are the 5 areas of giftedness. One thing, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time delving into those, but one thing I do want to note is that what we often see happen when schools start to get into this, looking at their equity issues and gifted identification, is they start identifying students from underrepresented groups in the non-academic areas. So a lot of times you'll see like large underrepresented populations in the creativity or the visual and performing arts. So we want to make sure that we realize that students from those backgrounds are not just gifted in non-academic areas. They 100% should be identified and recognized in that general intellect and specific academic aptitude. So when we're applying kind of the special considerations policy, our main focus is using it for general intellect and specific academic aptitude where those test issues come up. One thing to note about leadership in terms of these underrepresented populations is there's oftentimes a lack of identification in the underrepresented groups in leadership as well, because we tend to, again, apply that white male upper class norms of leadership when identifying, and so we sometimes miss those kids that 100% have leadership behaviors, but they come out and are presented in a very different way because of their culture's kind of understanding of leadership. So this is the identification policy for not using special considerations, what it would take to identify a student in general intellect and specific academic aptitude. So both of these areas require 3 pieces of evidence, and one of those pieces of evidence does have to be a test data point. So in general intellect, in our district, that's COGAT. Of course, coming outside of the district, or some families have their child tested differently. There are other tests like the Terranova and WISC, but they have to have a 9 stay 9 on an intellectual ability test that's state approved, as well as 2 additional pieces of evidence, such as some of the things listed and goes beyond that. For specific academic aptitude, same thing. Stay 9 is required as one piece of evidence on a achievement test in our district, that's MAP, as well as 2 additional pieces of evidence. And so if you're looking at white students, for example, that are not socioeconomically disadvantaged or don't have IEPs or things like that, then this is kind of the identification process. We wanted you to see this before we go into how special considerations comes into play.
And Lindsay, there's a really good question in the chat, since I think the next slide is mine, about elementary programs. Could you maybe mention, oh, nope, this one's yours, so I'll take care of it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay. And then one other thing I wanted to note, and this is like a common thing we see in our district and statewide, is that a lot of times in identification of general intellect and specific academic aptitude, we are solely looking at a test. So as you can see, you still have to have 3 pieces of evidence. So a test score alone does not automatically mean this child gets identified for gifted. They do have to have those supporting pieces of evidence as well.
Okay.
So this is KDE's suggested implementation of special considerations. They suggest making sure that you include all educators that interact with that student, so special education teachers, special area teachers, their ELL teachers, and that all of those teachers are part of that process, because lots of times people beyond the homeroom may see gifts and talents that the homeroom teacher may not see. They also suggest using a gifted specialist, someone with their gifted endorsement, or your GT lead at your school to help collect evidence, teacher recommendation forms, including parent recommendations as well. And as you can see, KDE kind of leaves their implementation very vague, and that's purposeful to allow districts to kind of come up with a plan that is best for their population. As we know, our population of students looks very different than most of rural Kentucky's, and so this allows us to do what is necessary for equity in our district.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think I put you on the spot, and I appreciate it.
That's okay. So this is kind of JCPS's proposed special considerations implementation. We are in the process currently of getting this approved. Well, yes, we represent the gifted office. As we know in our district, things have to be approved higher up. So this is kind of what our office has proposed, and hopefully we will see approved in this published district-wide, but this is our suggestions for how to implement special considerations for equity. So first you start off with your 9 stay 9 and who can identify using normal identification measures. So just as a student is Black or an English language learner, if they have 9 stay 9, then special considerations do not have to be used, and that's fine. However, then we suggest going down to 8 stay 9. So 8 stay 9 for COGAT is a score of a 22 or above, with at least one of their subtests, so verbal, quantitative, one of those being an 8 stay 9. For MAP, you're looking at 90 to 95th percentile on MAP, so going all the way down to 90th percentile and looking at those students. And you might want to, and so you want to flag kind of those students that are performing in that 8 stay 9 as well, to look for further pieces of evidence that suggest their giftedness or not. Then you want to look for high scoring outliers within your school or subgroups. And so this looks very different at different schools. As you could see early on, and when we had our South End versus East End, just identification in general is different. And so we recommend using local norms. So there is a process where you can yourself identify local norms for your building, however, or subgroups of students. However, the district already does this, and it comes out of the testing department. It doesn't specifically come out of our department. So we don't have a whole lot of control in terms of how they do that or the information of like how they determine local norms. But when you, I believe when you pull up like in Cascade or in Infinite Campus, the assessment tab, it should identify local norms. Like if you're using local norms, it'll identify who's 9th state 9, 8th state 9. That is something I'm not an expert on, but those of you that have questions about local norms, if you email us, we'll be sure to get you more information about that. Or work with the testing department to get that to you.
It's really
looking for outliers. Sorry, I forgot where I was. Looking for outliers in your school. You want to compare students based on students that are similar in age, clearly, but also on their background, their experience, their culture, and their environment. So you want to look at those subgroups especially. So is there somebody who is an English language learner who is way outperforming most other English language learners that have been ELL for the same amount of time, things like that. And the last thing is to consider students holistically and not just based on test data. I know that tends to be where we start, but it shouldn't be the end. So we recommend, just like KDE, that you consult with and collect evidence from all educators who interact with that student. And consider things beyond test data. What is their class performance like? Do they have work samples, thinking about like what if they put in their JCPS backpack, thinking about their thought processes. You can use kind of gifted behavior checklists and behavioral checklists so that you're getting a more holistic view of that child and not just a test data point. Because the other thing with a test is it's only given once oftentimes, or 3 times a year if we're talking about math. And if they had a rough day or they weren't trying their best, that's just one data point. So making sure that we look beyond the test and that one test score does not define that child. And it definitely doesn't determine based on that one time of taking that test if they're gifted or not.
Great. Crystal just made an excellent point in the chat, so I was going to give her a shout out. Thank you. Yes, one test is not the child. We want to be inclusive as much as possible, particularly with special considerations students. So I'm going to go back to some schools, and I want you to consider JCPS School A, and I want you to just take a look. This is 3rd grade, which is typically the year we generally identify for giftedness, and you qualify by 4th grade. Primary talent pool is where we start to develop talent, kindergarten through really 2nd and 3rd grade, and I could let Lindsay add on if she's better at elementary things. So this is a school that's in the west end of Louisville, and I want you to see that if we were using regular JCPS policies, not one child would qualify for gifted ed. And research shows that 10% of any building is gifted. So that's any building, no matter the demographics. Statistics and research have proven that 10%, if not, we like to say 15%, to reach that net wider could be considered gifted. So what we want to make sure is that we look for outliers. As Lindsay said, the demographics of this school are all the same. It's almost 100% minority, and they have a large ELL population. And so you can see that the majority of the class is below the 50th percentile, with almost, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 students in below the 10th percentile. That's very low, as we know as educators. But then if you go to the other end of this example, the 2 students I've highlighted in red, they're not even in the 90th percentile. I happen to know who these students are particularly, and they are clearly outperforming everyone else in their class by several points in a measured test. So this would certainly be 2 students that I would start, particularly in this school, and maybe see what else we could find. Ask the teachers what they see in the child. And let's so I just wanted you to see, let's look at, this was their map math scores. I want you to see their reading scores. So these are the same class in the same building with a very large percentage of minorities as the population. And you can see nobody hit the 96th percentile. So that would mean through regular JCPS policies, again, not one student would qualify for academic consideration. And so I highlighted again the 3 students that I would keep an eye on because they're all in the 80th percentile, if not higher, while the next highest kid is in the 65th. That's a significant jump, so therefore becoming an outlier. And then you could even go in and look at the breakdown of their subtests and see how many high average straight across. That's considered exceptional. The other thing I want to bring your attention to is this building's COGAT scores. And I just want you to look at some of the sheer numbers. 13 students scored greater than 18. And I took a snapshot of their scores because it was such a small number. And you can see, if we're again just using regular JCPS policies, only one student would qualify for gifted ed. And the fact that a student in this building got that score is unbelievable statistically. And so the 23, the 21, all of those students who are close would be ones I would start flagging and maybe exposing them to some critical thinking and some very high level material and see if we couldn't bump them up. One student got the 24, and then 85 students, just to let you know, did not even get an 18 in this building out of all the kids tested. And again, I want you to notice the MAP scores that the majority of the students in this particular 3rd grade class are below the 50th percentile. So the 3 sitting in the 80th percentile are again the outliers that we're talking about. Different schools need different plans. This school desperately needs special considerations. So let's look at school B now. So I want you to look at school B. The MAP scores I'm showing you are math first, and then we're going to look at reading. And this is a building I would argue does not need any special considerations, because just look at the demographics of this 3rd grade class compared to the 3rd grade class. The lowest kid is 16th percentile, and only, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 kids are below the 50th. I'm rounding the 46 up. So 40, 37, only 4 kids. This is a different playing field, different school. The demographics of this building are about 70% white, just to show you the difference. And so looking at the scores here, I want you to notice that only one student got the 99th percentile, and that would be the only kid I would move forward with. Additionally, I wanted to show you their COGAT scores, and just to show you some of the biases that come into play here. 135 students tested in this building got greater than 18, with 46 students, which is shocking because that's a large number. 46 kids hit the regular JCPS gifted qualifications of 24 or higher, and only 43 students who were tested got less than 18. So clearly, this school needs to follow the rigid JCPS policies of 9th Day 9 and the 24 with the 9th Day 9 on a subtest, because otherwise we're just going to continue to create disparity in and overrepresentation. So let's look at the math scores. Excuse me, I think I'm clicking and okay. And so now we're going to look at reading. And again, same school with the demographics being majority white. I want you to notice that not one student would qualify in the area of specific academic, because none of them, the bottom highlighted yellow box, made the 96th percentile. So we just want you, I would certainly keep an eye on, and I'm not to say that these students couldn't potentially reach it later with some exposure to high level rigorous materials. These 3 could easily bump up into the 96th percentile would be my guess. So those are things that I would keep in mind, but just using policies, I would not recommend anyone in the area of specific academic aptitude in this particular 3rd grade class. So we've talked about a lot of these points, and I'm going to reiterate some of the things that Lindsay's already said. One thing I've noticed with working with gifted kids in the last 4 years, particularly in a building with high minorities, is the more exposure they have to the test, the COGAT, the better they do. So I would test 200 kids in third grade and they didn't get it in fourth grade. I'd test them again. I'd test them again in fifth grade. But what I did notice is by about sixth grade, they can get the qualifying test. So one of my assistant principal's friends said a lot of schools are doing this now. So we recommend that you give the test multiple times, particularly the 18 or greater if they're a minority or a underrepresented population. Continue to test them. Gap kit. Go ahead, Lindsay.
And that's a school-by-school decision of who gets tested. So those of you that are really wanting to be advocates for your kids, this is something you can push at your school level, is in fourth and fifth grade and beyond. Having more kids retested and not just those that scored, like a lot of times I've even been at schools where it's just those that scored like a 22 or higher or 20 or higher. So if you can be an advocate, this is one way you can do it at the school level, because it's a school-by-school decision of who can take COGAT beyond third grade.
Crystal, you had a great question. Kids are beyond a test score, but unfortunately KDE Law and coding counselors, I'm really talking to you, requires a test score. And until we can get that changed, in order to qualify for gifted ed in the areas of academics, a test score must be used. That's why we're trying to advocate for at least widening the net so that we do see more students being qualified in those areas. We don't want to judge a book by its cover. Many times in low socioeconomic buildings, behavior becomes a factor. And I'll be honest, everyone knows sometimes if you're bored, you can become bad. And I don't like to use the term bad. I'm just kind of being silly. But when I'm bored, I tend to get fidgety myself. I go off task and things like that. Kids are no different. And so we want to reiterate, you never judge a book by its cover. That's that gatekeeper. You have implicit and explicit biases that Lindsay's talked about. We have pictures of what gifted should look like behaviorally. We need to stop doing that and really widen the scope of what we believe. Another thing that students who are behind in reading or math are almost always overlooked for gifted services. All that means is they've never been taught. It has nothing to do with their cognitive ability. So, and quickly, statistics show if you expose the low reader and they have a high IQ, they will pick it up quite quickly, given the opportunity. So students who qualify for IEPs are almost often overlooked and or not even tested. We would certainly want to encourage you to not do that as well. Every child should be tested. And then of course, in Colin, our keynote speaker, Colin Seal's book, I liked this so much because I have been using the microaggression street smart, and I'm trying to watch my own vocabulary because street smart is just smart. And I'm using my own implicit biases there when I said that for years. And so I'm trying to model also that just means the kid is smart and they've manifested that smartness in a way that maybe you don't see in the classroom. So something to consider.
Before you go on, there's a lot of questions about the testing. And we didn't include it as much because we have assumed that it was mostly teachers who don't code students as gifted, but I think this is important to know about tests. If you are identifying a student for general intellect or specific academic aptitude, one of the three pieces of evidence does have to be a state-approved test data point. If they're in one of the underrepresented categories, so if they are a Black student, if they're Hispanic, if they have an IEP, and so on, they don't have to have that 9th stay 9 as the data point. So if they have they're in Infinite Campus, one of the boxes is 9th stay 9 on an academic test, and then there's another box that says high performance of achievement on a test. And so you would check that instead because they didn't have the 9th stay 9, but they still had a high test data point. whether you're using local norms or if they're just an outlier and they were 8th or 7th C9, things like that. So while we would love to be able to move forward with identification without testing, our current state law does not allow that. So a test has to be used, but in underrepresented populations, they don't have to necessarily have that 9th C9. I hope that clears all of that up.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. So we're going to just look at the next 2 slides are characteristics of general intellectual students and specific academic students. And I want you to peruse this list for a few minutes and try to think of students you've had, you currently have. If you're a counselor, you know, just take a look. These are interesting. I always love to see. My small amount of time in elementary school, the one that stands out to me is the bulleted has strong feelings and opinions. And that could be a complete meltdown on the carpet, crying. I mean, unfortunately, that's their feelings. That's how little people express their feelings sometimes if they haven't been taught to communicate using words. Another one is they prefer adults. That typically tends to show up in middle school. I have a lot of kids, they're kind of loners. They can construct and work with the abstract. And one of the biggest ones I want to point out is repetition for mastery is almost none. 1 or 2 times they get it and you've got to move on. And that's why in the differentiation area, when we get to servicing these guys, they get a lot of repetition. And so you want to make sure that maybe you give them something else to do so they don't become bored and a behavior problem. I'm going to go to the next slide and we're going to look at some more gifted characteristics. I want you to see if you notice a difference in these characteristics. Stubbornness, non-participatory, rushes, they don't have time for the details, they're cynical, perfectionism, they might have absent-mindedness, they might come across me like, huh? And you then, I've had students, and I must admit that I've tried to get off and catch them off task, and they can be standing on their head and reading a book, and I might say, Lindsay, what's the answer? And they'll go 12, and you're like, ah! So that's pretty special. If a kid can look off task and then suddenly still know the answers. They monopolize discussion. So these are the more, we don't like to say negative characteristics, but some of these are the ones we see oftentimes in underrepresented populations. So we wanted to bring these to your attention and help you realize that they might not necessarily be a behavior problem. They might be bored or under-challenged. Okay, we're going to look at some real kids now. This was a student that I had. I'm going to call him Dewan. And I kind of just want you to give you his stats first. In 3rd grade, he scored a 19 on the COGAT, so he would not even qualify for our advanced program. He got an 88th percentile in reading and a 90th percentile in math. And this is a true story. And this is some of those special, oftentimes we use the term other data points, and that's hard to concretely put that because it could be so many things for teachers. So I kind of want to give you this story. He was taking the MAP test and he had not learned to multiply because developmentally he hadn't gotten to that yet. And so I looked at him and I said, Dewan, you know, multiplication is just repeated addition. That's all I said to the child. And I showed him 6 times 2, and I showed him quickly that 6 plus 6 would equal the same thing. I look over about 10, 15 minutes later, he's got his scrap paper out, you all, and he has 67 times 19. And he has literally taken 67 plus 67, and he's doing that enough times that he's getting to his 19 times, and he was counting it out. If that is an exceptional kid, I don't know how to give you a concrete example. I told him one time, and he took that and applied it to the rest of his score. And you can see he got a 90th percentile in his math, which was clearly his area of strength. The other thing this child did was his mom ordered an old math textbook that he wanted online because he wanted to teach himself how to do math that he wasn't going to get taught during the 3rd grade. So those are real concrete things that gifted kids in early years do and look like. So I kind of wanted to show you that example. And then I want to look at a middle school kid, and I want you to think of her as Layla. I'm going to call her Layla. I want you to look at her COGAT score. It was a 21, so she would at least qualify if we're using regular standards for our advanced program in middle school. You can see her reading score was just in the 83rd percentile, and then math was her strength, and she had the 87th percentile. And so theoretically, Layla wouldn't qualify at all for gifted services. She doesn't have the test without special considerations. She doesn't meet any of the requirements that are just regular ed students do. So I want you to notice that she was given a passion project assignment, and she chose the topic of how reading and math affects our brains. So right there, I want you to notice that's a very concrete example of a topic that I taught sixth grade for 12 years. That was very rare to see a kid who was like, I wonder what reading and math does to our brains. Let's find out. Not very often. So there's some of those characteristics showing up. In her essay, she wrote and used vocabulary that was well above her developmental age. So another thing to notice that you might see in student examples. She showed a strong command of the English language, far outreaching what we've worked on in sixth grade. So, and she's highly eager and focused when you wanted to talk about this. And she wanted to hang out with me at lunch almost every single day instead of her peers, because she knew I would listen and talk to her about things. And most sixth grade girls don't want to sit around and talk about reading and math and what it looks like. So I wanted you to see these examples to really help you open up and widen your lens of these characteristics in underrepresented populations. And I don't think we're going to have time, so we're not going to be looking at LaShondra. We were going to have you practice. This would be something I would suggest you do with your staff, or if you want to email me, I can run a PD for you, and we could complete this as a staff to kind of look. But what it is a vignette about a underrepresented student, and then we were going to have you practice using special considerations and the characteristics to see if you felt she would qualify. But because we are running short on time, we want to make sure to give you 8 to 10 minutes to fill out your Google exit slips and things like that. We're not going to have time for that today. And here, I'm going to let Lindsay, but I know many of you in the text chats, and I love it. So what are we doing? How can we fix this? And this is what we're trying and what we're advocating for. So I'm going to let Lindsay here's what we're hoping to change.
Yeah, so this is kind of just a wrap up of different ways we're trying to combat the inequities in gifted education that are rampant in our district, in our state, and across the country. And so the first thing is starting with talent development in primary talent pool. So using equitable identification practices, because in primary talent pool is an informal identification process. So that allows us to not use test data. It is not required to have a test data point for kindergarten through third grade in primary talent pool. And so using more equitable identification practices so that we can develop that gifted potential at an early age will help them get identified starting in fourth grade. Universal screening, so making sure we screen every child, don't determine who is tested or screened based on teacher referrals or recommendations, kind of being that advocate to retest a large number of students for COGAT and making sure that we're not kind of selecting our gifted beforehand by deciding who gets screened or tested. Providing more opportunities to showcase their gifted learning abilities. So we have a lot of inequities in that students are not having opportunities to learn at a high level, but also to engage with rich or high level tasks. And so therefore their gifted abilities are never given a chance to be observed. So providing those rich, rigorous tasks that allow those gifted characteristics to come out. Using a holistic view, so what we talked about a lot in this presentation is not stopping at the test data point and not defining a child based on one test score. Using local norms or looking at those outliers, so going beyond the 9 stay 9. And then one of the biggest ones, which is why we are so glad so many of you are here, and I've seen a lot of this in the chat of talking about other groups of people this would be so good for, is that we need educators trained on how gifted characteristics and behaviors manifest themselves in different cultural, linguistic, and socioeconomic groups. So getting away from that acultural view of giftedness that tends to default to that white middle class, upper class norm. So being able to train more people on how giftedness shows up in those different populations.
And I'm going to go back to the talent development. One of the, Lindsay and I both got our endorsement through the same program together. And so one thing research shows again is if you expose little people, K1, 2, 3, to these rigorous complex tasks, starting very early on, all the way through 3rd grade, the research suggests these kids will do much better on the COGAT in general or cognitive tests. And that's kind of the point, is we just need stronger early on to make a difference, to start seeing the snowball effect into the upper grades. And so we are shouting out response lessons. We are doing them all week and showing schools what they are. They are inclusive, they are equitable, they are fabulous. I have trained several elementary schools last year, their entire staff, or the primary teachers, I should say, in this process. That is something we offer. So I hope that if you're interested, if you're a counselor or an admin, reach out to me and we can organize that. And I think we are at our almost 53. So I told you I wanted to let you have time to either stay on and ask questions with Lindsay and I, or if you need a break, you've got about 8 minutes before our afternoon sessions begin. And I know Lindsay has to start right at 12. So Lindsay, if you want me to stay in for a minute, or if you decide, but I'm open at the 12 o'clock spot. So I'm gonna remain in here for just a few minutes to see if people have questions through chat, or you can just unmute and see if we could ask a question. Thank you for attending today, you guys. We appreciate it.
I'm going to post the walk-in sign-in sheet one more time. Again, if you have registered on PD Central, I have taken attendance multiple times to make sure that you all got counted. However, if you did not register on PD Central, we need you to go to this walk-in link and put your name on it so that you can get your PD credit. And then I have a lot of questions about the Google form. Unless you want to fill it out multiple times, we suggest that you wait until you have finished all your sessions for the Gifted Institute to fill it out. That way you only have to fill it out once. Because there's a way for you to just check all the sessions you attended.
And Lindsay, did we get a regular attendance? You didn't mention anything,
Yes.
So I'm assuming we're good to go on that end. So registered participants, we've got you and your attendance checked. Thanks again, you guys, for coming. We really appreciate your working on a summer day, for most of us anyway. And if you have any questions, you can unmute or type it into the chat. I'm going to stay on for just a few minutes and then we're going to finish up.
Hi, Jennifer. Ms. Liepman here. And I was just wondering what would be your suggestions for encouraging students who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And just something I noticed in the last year of teaching in 6th grade was that a few students being handed the thing like, hey, we want to test you for the, see if you're gifted. And a lot of them asked me what that was. They didn't really know what it was. And so I explained to them what was going to happen as a teacher as best I could. But the biggest thing they said right away was, but my friends aren't in those classes. And the fear of being pulled away from, I think, you know, the students that they do have commonalities with, and the people that look like them, and the fact that, you know, one student said like, but if I go to that gifted class or that AP class, all the students are white and I'm Black. So
those are real.
And getting parents on the same side as well, because I've had parents state, well, my student's going to be possibly the only Black student in that class then.
Yeah.
Lindsay, you have anything to add, or do you want me to address it?
Like,
No, it's a good one.
That's a really good, that's part of, I don't think that's where the equity issue comes from, but that is a hurdle that we have. And I think that a lot of it depends, and I think it starts with the family outreach, because you're right, there is a lot of families who, there's two kind of sides of it. There's families that have don't know anything about gifted, and so therefore they've never known to advocate for that for their child. And then you have certain cultures where they don't want their child identified a lot of times. And so I think starting with family outreach from the school level is really important, or even like teacher level. I think the closer the person is to the family, the better and more trusting that relationship is. And I think part of the problem is also, like, that's kind of the problem with gifted classes that are self-contained, is there's a stigma with that. And you do get the ones who, yeah, I won't be with all my friends, or I will be the only Black student or the only Hispanic student in there. And that's a problem. And you even get the whole, my friends will make fun of me if I'm like in that class. And so I think some of it is being able to service gifted students without just like a self-contained gifted class. And there's a lot of, I think Tiffany and I on Wednesday at 9 are presenting on cluster grouping, which is different than putting all the gifted kids in one class and no one else. Is a good option of creating class lists in a way where the gifted students are clustered, but they are intertwined with other groups of students as well. And I think, again, it comes down with like building that relationship and trusting and getting that information out. Because a lot of it's just they don't know, or there's a misunderstanding. And honestly, the equity issue leads to them kind of thinking that way too. Is if we didn't have, 60% of our district's identified population being white, and there was a more of a balanced demographics, then maybe they wouldn't, feel that way about being identified. So some of it's on us to fix the representation, and then also kind of educating both students and families. I think at the elementary level, starting with families is best, but middle and high school, I think helping students become advocates for themselves and talking to them about that is important.
And Hannah, I would just add there that the more you expose them to students and adults who look like them, then they'll start to see that that stereotype is not accurate, or we're hoping to change it. And maybe you could encourage them to be the one who makes the change for me. I really want you to be the one who wants to go into that class, because you definitely need it. I use analogies a lot with athletes, or things they could represent. So you would say, do you think LeBron James wouldn't have gone into the NBA? Or just something very simple. It's not anywhere close to the same, but at least gives them the idea that there is a chance, and this is your chance. And we want them, to encourage their friends that to being smart is important, and you have it. So let's use it.
Thank you.
Sure. That's a hard question. It was a really good one. Thank you all for being here. Lindsay left us because she's presenting at noon. Does anyone else have any questions for me? I'm going to stay on about 5 more minutes. Thank you, Mary and Crystal. It sure does matter. Representation totally matters.